For those of you that have ever been in the military, you know that whenever you have gripes, you move it up the chain of command, one rung at a time. Well, unfortunately, for some reason, Joe Hooker has never really discovered this rule, despite the fact he was a pretty experienced soldier. Joseph Hooker is not only has a problem with Ambrose Burnside, but instead of taking it to Burnside himself and to their superiors and so on and so forth, he goes straight to the top. He goes to Lincoln and basically tells Lincoln, if I were commanding general of the Army of Potomac, I would produce miracles. Well, Lincoln, listens to him, despite the fact this is completely unorthodox, and Burnside will ultimately resign from his command, and Lincoln will appoint Hooker in his place. Now, Hooker's going to turn around the army, because by the time you get to Hooker's command, the army is demoralized. It just got its butt kicked in Fredericksburg, and it's basically literally mired in muck. In fact, they try to march through the countryside of Virginia in what's known as the Mud March. It's just a downtrodden. People are deserting. It's just the army is just not doing very well. So Hooker shows up and he says, "Okay, we're turning this around." And he does a few things, like gives them better food, trains them, and allows men that do well in these inspections to go home for furlough for a few weeks to spend time with their families. And so on and so forth. I mean, he even gives a general amnesty for any deserter that returns to the army before a certain date. So the army, by the time we get to the Battle of Chancellorsville, the army's looking good. And so then Hooker is going to basically have his one campaign. His campaign is going to be very simple. He's going to basically outflank Lee. He's going to make Lee come to him, just like what Burnside was going to do. But what he's basically going to do is he's going to put about 10% of his army across the Rappahannock River from Lee, and take 90% of the army and secretly move it all the way across another part across the Rappahannock and come in from behind Lee, so that Lee would not be able to figure it out. Well, something happens. Hooker somehow loses his nerve after he successfully moves his army around Lee's rear. And so Lee ultimately will find out that most of Hooker's army is actually behind him. And in the Battle of Chancellorsville is going to commence, and it's going to be the greatest victory that Lee's ever going to have. Why? Because one of the reasons why is because Lee is dealing with a much smaller army than he normally has. He sends one of his chief lieutenants, Longstreet, down into the Carolinas. So almost half of his army is gone. And what is he also going to do? He's going to split his army. He's going to divide it into half, and he's going to give half of it to Jackson in order to defeat the defeat the Union. This is something you don't do. You never divide your forces on a battlefield in the face of your enemy, of a larger enemy. It's just it's just unheard of. But nonetheless, he's going to dispatch his chief lieutenant, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and he's going to take his army and outflank the flankers. And then Jackson does that. He moves all of his men straight over, around the flank of the Union Army, and surprises the heck out of the Union Army on May 2nd, 1863. The problem is the attack is going to be too late in the day. It's very dangerous to fight during the night, and therefore by the time you get the sundown and the nighttime, Jackson has not achieved the extent of the victory that he wants, the extent of pushing the Union away. So what does he do? He goes out and he rides between the lines to find out where the two sides are. The problem is going to be that he's going to be returning to Confederate lines at night, and it's very hard to distinguish a Southern soldier from a Northern soldier in the middle of the nighttime. And so when the Jackson and his men are racing back to the Confederate lines, they encounter Confederate pickets, basically outposts of sentries to make sure that the army as a whole is not surprised. Well, he runs into these pickets, and the pickets thinks he's a Union soldiers, and so what do? They open fire on him. He gets injured in his left arm that needs to be amputated, and I believe in his right hand. That night, his left arm is amputated, and when Lee is told about Jackson's wounding, Lee is famously going to say that Jackson may have lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. Well, Jackson survives the surgery, but unfortunately, an infection sets in. He contracts pneumonia, and on May 10th, 1863, will ultimately die from this pneumonia. So thus, it's a major loss to the Confederacy. But nonetheless, Lee is able to defeat Hooker's army, despite the fact that he doesn't have Jackson anymore. He's able to push Hooker's army back across the Rappahannock in what we call Lee's most perfect victory. But again, what's the cost of this victory? The Union Army goes away and licks its wounds and reforms, whereas now Lee has to basically replace a man like Stonewall Jackson, somebody that they ultimately could never replace.